used to involve a company called BL Systems, then called it still. You might just have heard of it. You might even have heard of BL. Pretty sure.
No, also, yeah.
But it's something of the front. But for the last 17 years, he's been chairman of Research Machines. He's going to tell us about research.
Thank you very much, David. Can I begin by saying what a pleasure it is to be with you today. If most of you have heard of RM, of Research Machines, I find it amazing that as I talk around outside either people like us who know a lot about the computer world in this country or education, people have never heard of it. That's changing as a generation of people who are at school come through. But I'm going to talk about the history of RM. Nobody has ever given a talk on the history of RM before. We don't have a history written down, so I've had to do quite a lot of digging and had to decide what theme was I going to take. In my digging, I came across this report. Whoops. This report. Now, it requires a certain amount of lateral thinking to understand what it was on about. And it is, of course, an Australian report about the state of Victoria. But I also read recently in The Guardian this little bit about Kenneth Baker. I had dinner with Kenneth last week talking about this. And I'm not going to read many of these slides out, but this one I will. It's easy to forget the computer revolution and the resistance caused when Kenneth Baker, when he was Secretary of State for Education, introduced the idea of a computer in every school. At the time, nobody, not teachers, not pupils, knew what to make of the technology, though the pupils were notably more eager to make use of it. Anyway, I looked around and I found this, which somebody drew it as a cartoon. Actually, it's more like reality these days than a cartoon, and so is this. Even this. So certainly my youngest grandchild was doing that at about that sort of age. And I looked, I hope we're not going to lose too much on the top of the screen. Mainly it's just titles, so I don't think I'll lose much. I was looking back at this report, of which you're all well aware, and I was involved in some of the computers at the very bottom of that screen. But I'm really talking about computer companies then. I'm not sure, let me just see whether I thought we'd set it up so it's the image itself. Computers then, I'll talk about now and then. And if I look back at the environment that RM's been involved in, these are some of the companies that existed. In fact, the reason I'm doing this today, as Roger Johnson said to me a few months ago, RM's one of the few British-owned computer companies that's still around. It'd be interesting for you to come along and say why. I foolishly said yes, which is why I'm here today. And I look back now, what were the companies that have disappeared? Or the one in the bottom right-hand corner hasn't disappeared, but Lord Sugar said not so very many years ago, Vigland's going to be the company that takes over the role that RM provides. So a lot of companies have been around in this sort of area. I would actually add other companies to this list, and you would too. And I'll perhaps talk about that a little bit at the very end if we have time. But those were computers then. RM then started off in a warehouse in Tesco's in the County Road in Oxford. Two Mikes, whom some of you knew, Mike Regan and Mike Fisher, two great men, set up a thing in a warehouse in Tesco's. Fairly soon made something big enough to move to Mill House. If you go to Oxford by train, almost from London, you almost invariably stop at the cemetery. And if you peer over the cemetery, you see Mill House, which was a super building. It isn't, as you'd expect, an old mill house. But we moved on, and today we have New Mill House in the top left-hand corner, which is a modern office building, in Abingdon, just outside Oxford, and a factory in the bottom right-hand corner, and operations in a fair number of parts of the world. Fairly recently, outside the UK, you'll see I've highlighted one thing in particular in India. We've got in Kerala, which is an unusual place for a company to go, but for some very good reasons. And I thought to myself, what history, when we talk about the history of our own, what should we do? It's quite a complicated story. And I found myself with the same challenge that somebody writing a biography of a person with a complex life. Do you do a chronological thing and keep flipping from topic to topic, or do you do a thematic thing and somehow miss the chronology? I decided I should do both. It's complex because of this. It's a hardware story, and a couple of us were talking earlier on that it's not just a hardware story. If it had been just a hardware story, it would have been a very short story. It's also been a software, applications, network, communication story. So that's quite a lot. But it's also been a story of changing its corporate structure, of the impact of government, and that impact continues, and the growth in services, subsidiaries, but I'd say something about the financial position over that history, although not very much. So it's complex because of that. So I decided I'd give you a chronology. That's the chronology. Now, I'll give you 3 minutes for this slide. So this is the 70s, and the two Mikes got together in 73. They started off selling components and small subsystems, and in 78, late 77 or 78, shipped the 380Z of fond memory. In the 80s, a network. I'll say a bit about networks, and the edging into the IBM compatible world, first of all with the early Nimbuses, and then with truly compatible machines thereafter. And the 90s lots of things. I'm going to whiz through these because I'm going to come back to them, but just so you see the sort of sequence of which things were done. We got some private money in the early 90s to expand the company in quite a dramatic way. Window blocks, the thing that killed Acorn, the software thing that killed Acorn, so it wasn't a hardware thing. If we'd fought the battle, I doubt if we'd have won. We became quite quickly the biggest supplier to education, launched networks. By 93, we'd sold our millionth computer. We floated in 93. I was chairman at that stage. We got involved in the internet very early. And networks keep cropping up all the way through this. In a school environment, networks are crucial and sophisticated, and much more demanding than in an office. Email, got into email, I'll come back to that, and getting into curriculum stuff, maths. By the late 90s, we connected a quarter of the schools in the UK to the internet. Got into managed services. The first serious PFI project in education was us doing managed services for all the schools in Dudley and the West Midlands, which we're still doing. And we got involved with Tesco, their computers in schools project. All this by the end of the 90s meant that Acorn was squeezed out of the market. It was principally because some of the things in this list. In the ooze, or whatever one calls the last decade, we got involved in examinations, and that's a big area for us. Launched the first tablet PCs and whiteboards and learning platforms, set up the Indian operation, more networks, launched a new type of computer. Roger Johnson asked me if I'd bring along today's products, which I have done, which I'll put up on the table in a minute. 2005, the letters BSF came into our vocabulary. That may not mean much to you. Now it's a £40 billion programme in which our is a big supplier, which Michael Gove killed off about 6 weeks ago. RM Mobile One, Glow, which is, I'll talk about again first, the only national system that links all the schools in the country together. The launch of the first netbooks, which was an RM ASUS partnership, networks again, and ending on a slightly somber note, the cancellation of the BSF program. So that's the chronology. What I'm now going to do is, and it means that RM today is involved in a whole range of things, whether it's infrastructure or hardware or services. I'll say a bit more about that. And the financial position, I'm doing this in true Daily Express terms, that's the financial growth. But I'll come back to that at the very end and put some numbers on it. So now I'm going back to the thematic way of looking at the history. First of all, the hardware. And all of us know about the 380Z, still unequalled in some functions. And I used to go to the City of London school where they still had a 380Z in their classroom, certainly until about 5 years ago, because it's the only device that you can use to stand on to close the windows. In fact, that wasn't, that's actually the first machine, the blue one. No, we didn't make many blue ones. People tend to think of the 380Z as a black machine. In fact, this is issue 2 of late lamented Personal Computer World back in '78, which does a review of the 380Z. And it's quite interesting, up there it says, computer in the classroom. This is '78, computer in the classroom. They could not have imagined what we would be thinking of today. And then and that obviously was the Zilog Z80 chip, as was this, the 480Z, CPM, looking a bit more like computers we know them today. And over lunch we're talking about the Doomsday Project. People know that the BBC was involved in that, and BBC Micro, so was RM. In fact, we've got a little museum now in RM, and the Philips Laserdisc thing is sitting there linked to whatever computer we used as part of the Doomsday Project. And then Nimbus, from the mid-80s onwards, with using an AMD sort of equivalent to the Intel chip, beginning to look IBM compatible, but with some quite serious incompatibilities. So we had the X series using all 3 of those Intel chips. In fact, from now on we were using Intel chips, 286, 386 and 486, and using the AT bus, but still not fully compatible. Still with RM's own graphics capabilities, because we felt we needed better graphics than you could get on straight IBM compatible. But in '89, we went right over to being PS2 compatible and truly IBM compatible from that point. And that was quite a watershed, because that meant we changed the nature of RM. Until that point, we'd got engineers who designed printed circuit boards and circuits, and had manufacture of circuits, and the testing and so on, simulation of circuits. And at that point we stopped. And that's why we got capital in. Remember I said we got some private capital in, because we totally restructured the company. And Mike Fisher, with the extraordinary vision that he always had, said, this company needs to become a services company. And that's easy to say in retrospect. At the time it wasn't, because other computer companies weren't really seeing it that way. But as I said, thereafter 100% IBM compatible. And we, all of the generations of Windows, and Intel, based on Intel most of the time, and underneath our networks, our IBM network software. But now we also embody Unix and Apple, and a number of other things within the overall thing that we deliver. And that would have been hard to believe back in the 80s that we would ever do that. So it's 100% compatible, but all the time, as I say, with added innovation. So if we're to continue to be competitive in making computers, and we still make computers. Last year we made 100,000. We're the biggest maker of PCs in the UK. Not many people know that. To do that, to beat Dell particularly, we have to out-innovate. I don't know whether I have. So the sort of thing we've done is this. We got very early into tablets. We were the launch partner with Microsoft of the Microsoft first attempt at tablets. And so I've seen some fascinating examples in schools of a classroom of people with tablets and a very skilled teacher interactive with a wireless system to material. And we had a review in Educational Computing and Technology, reviewed the first tablet that we launched, said when you do see the machine, try it. You'll probably have some reservations. Just remember, this could be the first stage of a revolution. If it's as good as this now, what will it be like as it develops over the next few years? And of course, Apple has shown us quite recently what it could be like over the next few years. And this is an unfinished story. Now watch this space. If I'm giving this talk in 2 years' time, I'd be talking about some different things here. And netbooks. Now we ASUS, who really worked with us to launch the first netbooks, a £179 computer that's got good wireless interconnection, good network connection, Unix-based, different Atom processors and so on, £179, transforms some schools' ability to give something to every child. And today's computers, we're trying to all the time ask teachers, what do you need? So we developed the thing on the right. The one on the left is an early version, an ugly early version of it. But we took engineers and teachers, sat them down together and said, if you could design your own computer, teachers, what would you have? And really what came out of it was this, which is, it's the RM1. And what they said was, one of our problems is we haven't got much desk space, so please can have it be narrow. So it's a full-size motherboard, and we want, the children love sticking pens through the plastic screen on a TFT screen. Please can we have the class. We want all the connectors at the front, and we want anti-graffiti paint, and we want to be able to lock them to a desk but still be able to move them around, and lots of other features were built into that. And it took the thing market by storm. You know, we sell thousands and thousands of them. It came out of sitting teachers down with engineers. And then we got in, it's eco-friendly, it's very low power consumption, it's very quiet, it's touch screen based, and many, many other features. And the other thing was, sometimes we get it wrong. This is hidden away in the factory in Abingdon. It's a thing with two screens. Goodness knows how to use a thing like that. People are ashamed to admit, I think, that we ever developed it. But teachers have similar things to say about mobile things. So we produced, that's called the RM1, and we produced the RM Mobile one, which is drop tested to military standards. I'm not going to drop it, because I honestly don't know what would happen. But it's rubber, it's bound in rubber, and again it's got a glass screen, and the sort of connectors that school need, the ability to control those from the network in a different way from the way ordinary PCs get controlled. So there's a hell of a battle still going on, and we still make, as I say, 100,000 computers a year in Abingdon, using British workers and competing fairly with those who use workers in lower labour cost economies. The software. In the very early 90s we decided this was going to be a battle of, the battle wasn't going to be about hardware primarily, it was going to be about software and services. And we developed the thing that killed Acorn above all, is something called Window Box. Somebody had the bright idea in about 1989 of putting the whole of the Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2 curriculum in a software product that's pre-installed, delivered to a primary school, switch it on, and you can immediately use it. So it gives, this is earlier, because we've lost the top, it's early years, Key Stage 1 software for very young children, for modelling and control system creation, doing music, IT skills and data handling. And all that was pre-packaged, and there was nothing else like it. So it was quite a revolution. In 2002 we celebrated 10 years of Window Box. Now we still sell it, but it's now an online version. And in a way it was a harbinger of things to come, that it wasn't going to be a battle. Now, Acorn didn't do this sort of thing, nor did some of the other casualties. We saw this as the way the schools needed to operate, and that we had to do if we were to differentiate ourselves from all the other companies producing PC lookalikes. And then in the early 90s, we began to think about interactive systems, and we found a company in the States that had done tremendous work on particularly maths, helping children on their own in an interactive way learn maths. And we got the license from a very specialised company in the States for something called Success Maker. And it's a superb, for its day, it was a superb way of learning maths. And I saw this in operation, we saw it all over the UK. And I remember seeing on one occasion going to a school in Coventry in a pretty poor area where there was a class of about 30 and the maths teacher had split the class in two with 15 people in the middle and computers around the outside running Success Maker. So he would teach 15 and the other 15 would work together, and if they had a problem when they were together as a group, they would particularly talk about that. And I stood by one boy who was working through one of his exercises, and it was algebra of some sort, came to the end, the system rewards, this was a sort of 13, 14-year-old boy, rewards you at the end by giving you a gold star or the equivalent for a 14-year-old. And he said fantastic, perfect. And he stood up, turned to his friend, the friend said, how'd you get on? And the chap said, hopeless, I couldn't do it. And that was one of the things we learned ever so much, the privacy to fail for boys particularly, was something that this sort of thing helps. Boys don't like saying, God, yes, I was good. Girls do, of course. That's not a sexist remark. Success Maker, there are lots of these sort of anecdotal things. Students are happy and enthusiastic because they work at their own pace, remarked improvement in skills. That's mid-90s, that's 15 years ago. Things have moved on quite a lot from there, but it was one of the transitions for RM, realising that this whole interactive way of teaching was going to be the future, if we could handle it. A few years later, a different way. This is again maths, and it's again interactive, but this is whiteboards, when whiteboards have become fairly prolific. And this is an interactive system again where the teacher's running an interactive whiteboard and has got a class who can come up and touch the whiteboard and move it and so on. And again, an anecdotal chap, a friend of mine, well, not a friend, somebody I knew who was chief executive of the London Stock Exchange, used to say to me, this computers in schools, John, it's a load of rubbish, waste of money. Show me somewhere where it's being used well. And I took him to a school in a rough council estate, just outside Oxford, to the secondary school, to show him this thing, Maths Alive. And I always remember when he and I, and a chap called Don Cruikshank, arrived at the school. We went along to where maths was being taught, and the first unusual thing was to see 13-year-old boys hammering on the door to get into a maths lesson. And we went in, and it was a very good maths teacher, and the class, again of about 30, split into 3 projects. And they were learning algebra, and they were competing with each other, and the boys wanted to show off to their girlfriends. And the way they were learning algebra was through handling problems in a game. And it was a haunted house game, getting through the haunted house. And the boys just wanted to get through the haunted house. Now, unfortunately, they had to learn algebra to do that, but they were determined to do it. And again, it was a very interesting, and it was highly interactive, with the teacher interacting, and children giving each other hints and so on. Revolutionary piece of software, that's alive. In fact, we ran some early conferences on it, and one maths teacher wrote to us and said, I've been teaching maths for 20 years. I was going to leave, you've given me a reason to carry on teaching, which to us was interesting. The government, in its infinite wisdom, in 2002, I think, the Tony Blair government said that we'll stop making modern foreign languages compulsory after the age of 14, but we're going to make it compulsory for all primary schools to teach a modern foreign language. That's an interesting contrast in how you handle schools, but most primary schools find that difficult. And there were a number of projects funded to help. We did a project called Sonica, which is to help primary school children learn Spanish. And this again is interactive whiteboard based, heavily media based, and linked to it. You can just see in the right hand side of that screen, somebody wearing green trousers and orange headphones on a mat. And in fact, it's a karaoke dancing mat. So part of the Sonica system is a karaoke dancing mat. That's tiny children. That's fantastic. And they can dance to control the system, learn Spanish at the same time. And finally, of the examples, Easy Teach is an interactive whiteboard subsystem. So it's like an operating system for interactive whiteboards, which we're selling all over the world, and we have agreements with whiteboard manufacturers that they'll deliver it with whiteboards. And there's lots of it with all sorts of subject area, and lots of other stuff of this sort. So part of the battle, when you say how to turn a proprietary hardware company into one that exists, is this sort of thing. There was a bit of a bomb dropped on us about 12 years ago. The BBC decided that it was going to nationalise part of the software industry. And that's my slightly loaded way of describing it. They decided they were going to take, again using my language, taxpayers' money, they call it licence payers' money, to develop software across the whole of the curriculum and give it free to schools. Now when you're running a company that's trying to sell things, to invest and so on, when a big thing comes along and says we're going to give it away, now that could have killed RM's development in this sort of area altogether. In fact, we fought it very hard, and it ended up with the trade restrictions people in Brussels saying that's illegal state aid. To cut a long story short, we stopped investing for quite a long time, and the sort of thing I've just been describing, it killed a lot of small companies off. Eventually the BBC had to withdraw, having done quite a lot of damage to the market. Then networks, when I say what history, networks has been a very big part of the story. Selling individual PCs, or even individual Apple Macs, is very different from providing a service to an institution. This is a newsletter, a page from the newsletter in 1981. I'll pull out one bit of it. It was announcing the network in 1981. We are calling the network Research Machines Chain. Some of you may remember that. A name which reflects both the linear topology of the network and the fact that a chain can contain many links. Now how sweet, really, when one thinks of networks now. But here was a brave new thing that we were setting out on. And chain lets 487 use and 480Z and 380Z people link together. In fact, we were delivering thin clients to what people would call them today, and people thought thin clients were a brand new idea, sort of 10 years or so ago, but obviously here we were delivering thin clients a long time ago, and it was the ZNet. Ultimately we didn't call it the chain anymore. We called it rather boringly ZNet. And then we had Ethernet links in 1990. And the whole network story has been a fundamental one. Now we've, if I just go by 2003 we're having this sort of network in primary schools, let alone secondary schools, a whole school network. 2004, links into the home to multimedia resources, centralized learning systems, the internet, email, a whole range of interconnections. And we spent, I think Ireland spent probably £20 million building networks over the last 10 years or so. So it's non-trivial in terms of investment. Very different from just selling a PC. And the Guardian recently did a review of the current network, and in a way it sums up all we've been struggling to do over the last 20 years, managing networks, automating lots of tasks, being proactive in finding failures, distributing software automatically, identifying problems, having inventories of software, getting children who've forgotten their password back on stream again so you don't stop a lesson, clearing out queues, muting sound, and lots and lots of other functions. Way beyond what you get in an office, miles beyond it. And today's network, which is the 9th generation of the network, supports XP, Vista, Windows 7, thin clients, the sort of netbooks, Apple Macs, and so on. And just I picked out a couple of things to show you. It's very easy to say networks. One element of the network is something called Securus, which is spotting bullying. It's watching bullying traffic, e-bullying, on the network, which is a growing problem in schools, and it can be very, very damaging. Another one is something called Tutor, that lets a teacher control the PCs in his or her lesson individually and communicate with individual pupils. So there are lots and lots of functions you would never dream of having in an office. And the chap in the Guardian who reviewed CC4, the Community Connect version 4, said it's the best off-the-shelf network around. And I think back from 81 to 2010, according to the Network Research Machines chain, that's a long, long way away. And then something that's really not used outside schools, and again a big area of investment, learning platforms. I don't know whether the word learning platform means anything to you at all. It is fundamental now in schools, and it's a way of linking everything that goes on in the school, all the applications. So it's through one window, a pupil or a teacher or a parent or a local government person or an examiner can get access to all the resources, whether it's the management systems, the assessment systems, the geography system, the attendance system, or whatever. And this is lots of different views through the learning platform. And what one has, if one wants it, and virtually 100% do, you have your own avatar that sits and so that identifies you in the learning platform. And it's quite sweet because on the bottom right hand corner there's an avatar that we provide off the shelf. We've had a lot of women teachers who say to us, I want 4-inch heels, please. So we've got avatars to suit you, madam. Kaleidos made a difference to learners and so on. It transforms the way schools can manage the overall technology world that we have today. So again, thinking back to the beginning of Mike Fisher and Mike O'Regan and components and 380Zs, it's a very, very different world. And all of these things are pretty dramatic. And probably the most dramatic of all is communications, because again in 1978 we couldn't have imagined the world of the internet. I launched the first general email service in the UK, email, in 1980, before we had the internet. And today, we got involved, this says communications, etc. at the top. We got involved in, I don't know whether we'll all still remember Mosaic, one of the effective early browsers. At that stage we were involved, thinking this is going to have a big impact. And then we launched Internet for Learning, which is a broad internet service aimed at schools, with a number of elements: Living Library, EasyNow, helping people get into material suited to the various stages of the curriculum. And we got involved in running interconnection service. The logo in the bottom left is actually Cornwall, that shape, that southwest grid for learning. So it managed the connection services for the southwest of this country, and SafetyNet Plus is a one of the problems obviously is stopping children getting access to material that we really don't want them to get access to. And so we've done a vast amount on that, and email. So living library is one of the elements. This was very early on, finding material across the internet, matching it to the curriculum, quality assessing it, and making it easy to match to the curriculum. And we did lots of it at junior school and secondary school, and lots of partners. So built into the living library was the internet, and maps from Philips, and the national monuments records, and the Mirror, and the Independent, OUP, and so on, so that we could channel through the internet stuff aimed at the curriculum to help teachers make the technology useful. And Easy Mail, we launched our email service in 1996. Some rather boring slides. It's the biggest email service in the UK, bigger than BT's email service, but it's purely within the schools world, so it's a large email service. And then finally, I think in the communications thing, I mentioned Glow. In the early part of the 2000s, the Scottish government decided they wanted to link all their schools so that schools in the Western Isles could communicate with teachers in Edinburgh or in Aberdeen. And against big competition, Little RM, who was really not known in Scotland, won the job of putting in Glow. And it's the only project in the world that links all the schools in a country together. And it provides learning platforms in the schools, intranets, and a whole lot of services. And because it's unique, a lot of people go to see it. And there are lots of states from the US and federal people and people from Europe and from the Middle East. There's one country that doesn't go to look at it. It's a country called England. But it would be like that, wouldn't it? And we run to support all these things, we now run great big data centers, as you might imagine. So that's the sort of all of the technology side of things, the hardware, the software applications, the communications, and networks. So it's not a simple story, as I said at the beginning. It's quite a complicated story. You can imagine the resources and the mix of skills that it takes to do those things simultaneously, because going back to the chronology, all this was interleaved throughout the last 30 years. Looking at the corporate structure, until 1990, the company was owned by the two Mikes, with a few others. But we needed capital. Once we became IBM compatible, and had to invest in things that other people weren't investing in, we needed capital. And we got some jolly good, Borgavet ran it, and we got first-rate people who became very good friends of ours. And 3i's invested, CVC, and we had a couple of people from them on the board of RM, and they added a lot of value to us. But when we started acting like a quoted company, we produced annual reports that looked like quoted companies, we paid dividends, and we'd had one or two aborted plans to float the company on the main exchange. But in '93 we made the board a bit bigger, and in '94 we floated on the main exchange. We floated at 35p. Today, mainly because of the cancellation of BSF, our share price is about 135 today. At the height of the madness of the dot-com boom, the share price was £10, which meant we were worth about £1 billion. Shows you just what the madness was like at the top of that ridiculous boom. It's very hard when you're a board of a company that knows the share price is mad. You can't go out and say to people, it's 4 times overvalued, sell. It isn't done. Anyway, we've floated onto the main exchange. Warburg's floated us, who are now UBS, and they've been our brokers and advisors ever since. We've paid dividends every year. In the early days, we were criticised by the financial analysts and by the institutions who owned us after the float for paying dividends. Naughty boys, you shouldn't pay dividends. Today, people say, oh gosh, yes, you must pay dividends. We've always paid dividends, so people always had a return, whatever the share price. And we started developing the board, and today we have a very, very strong board. it's a strange mixture. It's got Brian Carlsberg, who was first Director General of Oftel, was head of OFT, and was the head of the International Accounting Standards Board, and Joe Connell, who was Managing Director of Zansa, John Windler, who was Chairman of a bank when it was respectable to be Chairman of a bank, Mike Tomlinson, Sir Mike Tomlinson, who was head of Ofsted, wrote the Tomlinson Report, an eminent educationist, and Tim Brighouse, who was head of education for Birmingham, then was Commissioner for London Schools, and again another very eminent education. So it's a very strong board, partly technology, partly educationally based. Government is another area of the complexity. Looking back, Kenneth started it all. Every school should have a computer. I see him quite regularly. He said to me a few weeks ago, "John, you owe everything to me." On another occasion, he wrote to me, I sent up an annual report, and he wrote rather mysteriously, "From small acorns, great oak trees grow." And I had never quite understood what he meant by that. Anyway, Blair asked, Thank you, Edward. I will. Thank you very much. Tony Blair asked Dennis Stevenson, who went on to become, who was chairman of Pearson, to do a report on IT in schools. It was a very interesting report, and Dennis I know very well. He's a very bright man, and he talked about the concept of a national grid for learning. Something we puzzled about, because even after quite a few years, it's a bit like the Holy Roman Empire, which was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. This was neither national, nor a grid. Whether it was for learning, it was quite questionable. But there was a conceptual thing, and it was a very useful thing for us to use to explain to people why we were going in. We were absolutely in line with the National Grid for Learning. We used to quote it in our annual reports. And they set up BECTA, which has now been shut down by the coalition government, as an advisory body on educational technology, and we worked very closely with BECTA. The BBC I've mentioned, that was quite a hammer blow to the industry. Today, the BBC wouldn't contemplate, with all the pressure on the BBC, obviously they wouldn't dream of doing it. BSF, which as I say was a £40 billion project to rebuild every secondary school over the next 10 years or so. And sadly they called it the Building Schools for the Future programme, which meant it got led off to be a building programme, whereas it should have been a how do you teach children programme, and what effect does today's technology have. And we're by far the biggest provider in that, and a lot of, I think in the last 2 weeks, we have opened 36 new schools under the BSF programme successfully. So that's a lot. 36 new schools opened in the last 2 weeks. Brand new school, brand new technology. And finally the coalition, which has decided against carrying on with BSF and have not got they have said nothing at all about technology. So we had a board meeting yesterday talking about what we call G-Day, Gove Day, when he said end of BSF, what happens afterwards. Growth, lots of services growth, IP, intellectual property is the key. Now, if we're to win in this country, it's on this, and RM's way in advance of any company anywhere else in the world in this sort of IP. Services, managed services. We're about, I think, 10 years ahead in networks compared with offices, 15 years behind companies in terms of a strategic chief executive view of how technology should be deployed. By chief executive, I mean head teacher. So I think we're still, despite all I said, we're in the foothills of what we could do. And it's services, and I said at the end, as with all so-called computer companies that have survived. Now, I could have put a lot more computer company names on computer companies then. For instance, I would put IBM. Now today IBM obviously is a services company. And if you look at HP, it's more and more trying to become a service. I had lunch with Michael Dell about 3 months ago, And he only wanted to talk to me about was services, and how they're going to become us, and how interesting in RM, how have you done this services stuff? And in the beginning, the two Mikes were absolutely averse to the idea of partnerships with people and acquisition. They got such strong views and such strong different values, they didn't want to know about partnerships, and they were seen as arrogant by people. And I think at the time it was right. Today we make acquisitions, and I'm not going to go through all these, but we make quite a lot of acquisitions, and they're all in the education field. Some of them have made a big change to us. Now, for instance, the one right in the middle, TTS, is not really a technology company. And on the left there, you see I don't know what it looks like, a yellow ladybird or something. It's called a bee-bot. In fact, it's a robot, and TTS sells stuff of all sorts of educational stuff, particularly to primary schools. And we bought in it, and it's grown. It's more than doubled its size since we acquired it, and we've been adding technology into it so that we've helped them develop this electronic robot and helped them design a £35 video camera that you can drop, as well as you can drop a mobile one, and simple for children to use with a USB link, so that primary school children can go out in the field and video things and bring it back into their RM computer. And a music company and lots of others. And the one at the bottom is for special needs people, young people whose access to computers is restricted because of dexterity problems or sight problems or whatever. And we've got lots of partnerships that were unbelievable in the beginning. Some of them we've always had, Intel and Microsoft and Cisco. Tesco's a very strong partnership with us. But the more unlikely ones, at Cambridge Assessment, we're very deeply involved in examinations and assessment, and so we work very closely with OCR and all the other parts of Cambridge Assessment. And we run the IB examination transmissions across the world, so again in that form of examination. And LEGO, we have the European rights for LEGO education, which is all about control systems. It's all about robots. And then perhaps the most unlikely one, if we asked 15 years ago, is Apple. We're Apple's biggest channel in the UK for education, by far. So we just sell Apple as part of the offering that we make. And finally, growth, sales. This is about as good a slide as I could get from a 1990 report that showed growth from nothing to about 50 million between 77 and 89. And this, my graph again, from 85 at about 10 million up to about 300 million last year. And you can see that the reason it's jagged is all about government schemes. There's a big jagged thing above the number 0, and that's when there was a one-off project where we had a project working with the Open University, a great big education program to help teachers understand how to use IT in the curriculum. We won 60 to 70% of the business, and it was once off, and then it went away. So government has quite an effect. Shareholders, we've got the blue chip set of shareholders. Today, again, I'm not going to go all around this, but it's a very comprehensive set of interlocking things that this ex-hardware company provides to schools, and everywhere from PCs, all around this fan, through managed services, connectivity support, networks, learning platforms, management systems, exams, curriculum software, and resources for the classroom. And that's our aim today. Back to that. If we ask if we're doing sort of Michael Porter competitive analysis, why have we survived? We analyse it as these three things. It's, above all, it's focus, education focus. We never do anything outside education. But it's about having a big enough company to invest. We'd love to invest more, but we are big enough to invest in networks and learning platforms and so on. And we've got very good technical skills, the sort of people who design the lowest power consumption PCs on the market, and unbreakable notebooks and robots for primary school children and so on. This is just a little recent snapshot of where hardware fits in. See, hardware is that purple bit, and just between 2006 and 2010, hardware's gone from 36% to 25%, 26%. So you can see the trend. Actually, the percentages are a bit misleading because the absolute level's going up. So actually we're selling as many, but it's a shrinking proportion of the overall. And this is really the final thing of going back to Kenneth Baker and a computer in every school. This is today. A typical secondary school on the left, with a typical budget of 5 or 6 million, 1,000 people, 100 teachers, 3 hours, 800 computers, 200 applications. Typically on any one PC, 90 or 100 applications. Now how different from the home life of your own dear office? Your computers are not like that. And 60 whiteboards, 60 whiteboards. Now that's unique in the world. I was saying to somebody over lunch, I'm chairman of the council of the University of Warwick, if we've got 2 whiteboards in the whole of Warwick, I know we've got 2, but I think that's about it. And in a primary school, with £1 million budget, 75 computers, 50 applications, and 20 whiteboards. So Kenneth Baker's first innocent words led to something that really is a very different world indeed. So I think you can see why I said it was a complex story, and why I handled chronology first and themes secondly. And I was delighted to escape.
In spite of education.
He was Minister for Information Technology.
That's right.
He was the first and only. In fact, he said we gave him a honorary degree back in July, and I had to make, as Trade Chancellor and Chairman of the Council, I had to make a sort of vote of congratulations to all the people to whom we'd given honorary degrees. And I was sitting next to Kenneth at dinner, and he said to me, I reminded him of those first days when he was Minister for Information Technology and ran IT 82 year. He said, yes, John, I remember working with you then. God, you were bald then. and I said, that Kenneth said over dinner that he's the first and only Minister for Information Technology when he said that, and that he was kind enough to remind me of my lovely locks. You're right.
He persuaded Margaret Thatcher to support the industry. Because all other industries got no support from Margaret Thatcher, support, reduced support.
Well,
the Thatcher government made a big exception.
He'd been his PPS, he was in New Margaret, he was leaving it around.
But I say he did it in spite of the education, the Department for Education and Science.
Yes.
Who really wanted to talk.
Yeah.
And so when people said, Michael, you're in school, coming from industry,
yes.
It was a shock horror. Happy day.
It's very interesting to see the very wide number of applications in private references. At some stage, those pupils will in fact move into work. So, I haven't seen any more information how that does.
This is an easy question. The point was made that it was interesting to see the range of applications, but what we didn't talk about, how we make the move from school into industry, how we make that change. I'd have to go into a lot of detail. No, curriculum by curriculum, subject by subject. What I would say is that all the stuff we use is industry standard stuff. So that if you're going to use a computer in an office, the things you can't put in a school are the company-specific applications that a particular company's developed. What you will find is that you will come up against Word and Windows 7 and Excel and browsers, whether it's internet, whether it's Microsoft or Firefox. So all of the normal things we do. Now, in a more specialised area than that, you'd have to ask about what do you do about engineering and what curriculum things do we do about there. And then you're into following each of the curriculum strands, and that will take a very long time. There are all sorts of transitional problems. Certainly, it is a big issue. Now, for instance, think of what I just said about a typical typical school, secondary school. The pressure that puts on a university when children, until they come into a university, have been used to very high performance networks, a range of applications, networks that let them get access from any PC in the school or from home, and suddenly they come to a university that doesn't have those facilities. Most universities don't. They have they're different, very different ones. So so I think there are lots of transitional problems. And what I said earlier on, we're in the foothills still. We've done a lot, but I think when I'm here in 30 years' time, doing a refresh to you lot, it'll look quite different, I think, because we still haven't got. In some schools, we've got chief executives or head teachers who've got a vision, and some of those schools, some of the BSF schools particularly, have a vision of what 21st century education is going to be like. Lots haven't, and planning transitions until we've got that in place better. It's very difficult and ragged.
Can you put a number on that?
No.
How many schools are up with it and how are not?
I wish you'd all. We had a board meeting of RM yesterday morning, and we were talking about that, and because it's a critical number, and we try very hard to get the numbers. Our marketing and understanding the market is nowhere near as good as it should be. So we don't know well enough attitudes in general terms. We know we've got lots of anecdotal examples, some of the ones that other people quote to us, but giving a coherent picture is extremely difficult so far.
This is an invitation to make a comment. Absolutely fascinating what you've said, and those are questions I'd like to ask. The thing I'm really struggling with is everything you've described sounds absolutely brilliant. And if it was applied in every school in the country, it would be great. But how come we are still turning out so many kids who seem to have no qualifications and are functionally illiterate?
Well, what I haven't said is what the sort of things RM does changes the educational scene. On its own, it doesn't. We're almost back to that previous question, because you really have to look school by school. I because of the position I'm in and because of just my interests in life, I visit hundreds of schools. My old school is a school in Oxford that's top of the league tables, A-level league tables, an independent school, doesn't use IT very much. I also visit the school that was the bottom of the league table, Lillian Baylis in Lambeth, in a very deprived area, crime, asylum seekers, people, 70% of parents with English, struggling with English. And so when you ask general questions about achievement, you mix up such a heterogeneous situation. And I was really, in my last question, really, when I said I don't know, I know now that Lillian Baylis, which RM and the IT Livery Company together adopted about 8 years ago, is now right up in the middle of the league tables. Now that was partly an inspiring head teacher, it was partly some of the stuff I've been talking about here. There are schools where the head teachers think all this stuff is irrelevant. There's a minister who said to me, we don't need computers in schools. They can pick all that up when they leave. Now, so you've got such a varied position. If you go, 3 years ago, we opened the first BSF schools, and we opened some in Leeds, and we made a mess of it. It was in early days of introducing this network called CC4, and we didn't know whether, with these brand new schools, whether to introduce this pretty new product or put in the old one, know that within a year we'd have to take it all out. So we took the risk of putting in the new products, and it caused problems, to put it mildly. We stopped the schools opening, and it was that bad. And we had all sorts of problems, and it's really when I did lose my hair, whatever Kenneth Baker said. And eventually we sorted it out, and as part of the process of learning lessons, I took the board to Leeds the following year, in July the following year, to meet education leads who run all the schools. And they had teachers of the schools where we'd caused all the problems. And it was quite interesting because we then saw what a school with this sort of stuff used really well can do. And the children were incredible. And this is Leeds, where the schools had been poor. And they were achieving well, they're highly motivated, they're wanting to learn. Just in parenthesis, I'd say that when we opened the meeting, me, the chairman of RM, there's the chairman of Education Leeds, the first thing I said, sort of cringing, was, we've come here for you to hit us over the head and to tell us what went wrong and what we could have done better. And the chap looked at me very puzzled and said, oh no, that's not, we want to talk to you about our partnership. You're our partners. And you realise that they realise, the mature people realise this isn't a trivial thing and that it's tough. And those schools where you've got head teachers who've had the chance to have a radical relook are doing something very special. And the problem is they're quite a small percentage. That's why I say we're in the foothills. There's lots of correlations of where IT is used well, not necessarily RM technology, correlation between that and attainment, lots of it. The problem is there's lots of examples where people have spent lots of money on technology and it hasn't been used well. And it's all mixed up together. I think the problem is the numbers are big. You know, how many teachers are there? You know how many? 450,000. 450,000. So when you're talking about helping teachers understand how to do all this, you're talking about a very large number of people. Number of schools, 30,000 schools. So any generalisation, until we're much more mature, until we've gone up away from the foothills a bit, you can prove anything. You can prove it's all very good, or it's all not very good. In fact, we were agonising yesterday at the board meeting about how can we get a clearer picture? How can we? We don't want to invest money in stuff that isn't going to help young people have a better life. But most of us have got education engraved on here. So it's important for us to find out the answers to these general questions, but it's not simple. And any politician who thinks it is like any politician, really. Yeah, it's got one at the back.
Sorry, speaking from behind the camera. One of the things I found, because I was one of the part-time ICT coordinators for a school, I was the dad that looked after the computers in our local primary school, the early days of the RM Nimbus networks and so on. And one of the difficulties I think education always has is the level of investment.
Yeah.
Because the kids at home at that point had much better machines, technically, individually,
yes,
than the Nimbus machines on their desks at school. And you've always got to try and marry up the fact that you're always playing catch up with the home technology.
What you've just said is still true, except that it's untrue. It's back to the same problem. Some children have got much better stuff at home. Some children haven't got anything at home.
Yeah.
Yesterday, I was outside where we're holding our board meeting. We've got a thing called the Real Centre, where we have a lot of our stuff on show for teachers to come and have a look at. And yesterday, the primary school deputy head brought her class from Islington to Abingdon And there they were sitting in a horseshoe with an interactive whiteboard and somebody showing them, and they were going, oh and ah. And I talked to the deputy head and about this stuff, and she said, a lot of these children have never been out of London. They haven't got a computer at home at all. And to them this is just a miraculous world. Whereas the boys at my old school in Oxford have got better computers than we'll ever sell to a school. So it's back to this problem that we've got a very uneven. Now the last government tried to do things on that. We've got there's a programme for children in disadvantaged areas, where and it was a very good scheme that RM was involved in, and some other hardware providers, so that they got subsidised computers. And one of the mobile companies, Orange I think, maybe not, one of them anyway, gave free bandwidth to homes, because that's another problem. That the middle class children in North Oxford have got all the broadband they want, whereas in Islington, or that certain parts of Islington, not the bit where TB used to live, but certain parts of Islington haven't. So it's not a simple thing. And one of the problems in a classroom is the teacher doesn't necessarily know whether that child there has got Firefox and 50 megabyte bandwidth and this one here has got anything. It's not a simple issue yet, which is again why I say we're in the foothills. We've got a long way to go. The question is, are we going in the right direction? If we're going up a mountain, it's the wrong one. If that's what we really need to understand, I'd be seriously worried. Yeah.
We were discussing earlier over lunch these 13 questions that the Royal Society put down.
Yeah.
Now, they seem to think they're going to solve the IT and computer education issue by the answers to 13 questions.
Yeah.
It's quite clear from the story that you told us today that that's just not good at all.
I'll just switch the microphone off and the camera off. I agree. It's almost as if we are going back to saying, let's have a BBC Micro and learn to program in BASIC. That will solve the problem. One of the problems is that there is such profound ignorance about this overall topic. It's very. I would never criticise the head teachers who I say at one end of the spectrum. I'd never criticise them because it's difficult. And all this stuff that I've glibly gone through is a complicated picture. And for politicians to understand this, or eminent scientists to understand it, they don't spend any time on it. They don't go and talk to teachers and children and get involved. No politician, oddly, they used to. Kenneth Baker in the very early days, and in the early days of the Blair government, on one occasion we had the Secretary of State for Education and a Minister from Trade and Industry at RM together. Now that would never happen now. That wouldn't happen in the Gordon Brown era, or in the last 3 or 4 years of the Tony Blair era. So politicians are way away, and so are the scientists. And in some ways, so are universities. There's lots of research done into education, but this stuff, you point me to the person who's doing really good research into all of this. Anybody else? No, it's so there are some profound. There are people doing spot things. There are integrated learning systems. There have been 1 or 2 projects on that, but it's a holistic thing that needs looking at to help. So we have companies like RM trying to satisfy shareholders and schools and trying to work out and to answer very difficult questions. So it's the thing I find is that, God, isn't it exciting? Because if you put yourself back to 1978 and now put yourself here and you think, now what impact could you make on young people? Young people who are in a deprived household, and suddenly they're not. They've got the world, and their teacher sitting with them's got the world. And it's how we really put in place investment's a problem. BSF, having taken BSF away, has made the problem somewhat more difficult. But you can see that there's an exciting prospect ahead. And I've been in IT since 1962, and I thank I'm thankful that I was in on the pioneering days. I wouldn't want to change anything, except I'd love to be starting now. Because at this point in the foothills, you could address the question, well, you can ask the right questions. And yes, this one and that one.
Thanks again for the fascinating speech. And I'd like to question if everybody in RM is as motivated and committed as you are. I'll really jump in.
Well, can I say that if everybody in RM wasn't as committed as I am, I wouldn't stay in RM. But the reason Leeds said to us what they did when we made a mess of it one year and then came back the next year and said, oh, no, we want to be your partners, because down at the grassroots level, those REM people were determined this was going to work. And what does my heart good is when I go along to a school and I see some young RM people talking to, and it's a rare old, in RM it's a rare old mixture. Now obviously we've got engineers because they design these sort of things, but we've got somewhere like 300 ex-teachers and a sprinkling of heads. So it's a nice mix of really motivated people. I said I've got education and grades on here, so are they. And it makes RM different. It's culturally different. Culturally different from some of those companies that are no longer with us.
What do your 300 teachers do? Ex-teachers?
No, they don't. They do sometimes. They teach teachers, is one thing they do. But they help us work out strategy. Now, what should we do? What's going to make a classroom easier? Engineers can do a bit of that, but teachers can do it ever so lot more. And they provide consultancy help to head teacher who is struggling with the thing. They help us design. In the BSF programme, we had teachers leading bids to put in the BSF schools all over the country. So they do a very wide range of things. And some of them, and we have quite a Catholic mixture anyway. We've got at one end hard scientists, at the other end people. I remember a young woman who said to me one day, I host a dinner for new graduates each year, and one year and I have to be looked after, so one of them is assigned to me to make sure I know how to hold cutlery and which glass to use. And on one occasion, as a young woman, she said, I graduated from Oxford and I read medieval French. I don't really understand why you've recruited me. Now, a year later, she's right embedded in a project, delivering stuff to schools. So, and IBM used to do the same thing, and they still do. It's a mix of people we need. We need good engineers, but we also need people who know about the marketplace. That's the only one we're interested in. There's one, yes, there.
I'm fascinated that your business model moved from hardware into services and also includes software that you had to provide, and of course it's so often the software factor that sinks so many companies.
Yeah.
I've recently become involved in a small way in writing the kind of reports that I'm sure are included in your suite, which are for producing reports for teachers that show how the children have done based on their exams.
Yes.
And what has amazed me about that is the colossal amount of variation, even though there's a national curriculum. That is to say, the way you convert scores into marks, marks into grades, grades into levels, levels into assessment, varies not only from school to school, but from year to year, from class to class within year. And it's that determines whether at the bottom end you have an SEN, a special educational need. People here may not know, I didn't know, but there's a wonderful opposite of SEN, which is the top end, which is known as G&T. Stands for gifted and talented in this context, not what you might think. But anyway, what I'm getting at is, in the history of software production, a number of companies who've been faced with application areas which are highly parameterized. Some companies say, right, we'll take this parameterization on head on, and we'll produce software products that are immensely configurable. And in some cases, that decision has sunk the companies, and in some cases, it's made them. In other cases, companies have said, you do it our way, it's the only way we can keep the cost down. What's your strategy?
I'll give you a couple of examples. Now, Maths Alive, which is an example, that the one where boys were competing to get through the haunted house. That took the National Curriculum Key Stage 3 and took every element in the curriculum and built a whole of the curriculum, detail by detail, into it, and in an interactive system. That cost about £6 million to develop, and a long time. And you then do the simple arithmetic of how many schools are going to buy it and how much you then have to charge. And the reality is you cannot make that work in the UK. When you get into that sort of thing, you have to make it an international investment. So Maths Alive sells more quickly in the States than it does here. So it's a question of your ability to invest and how much market you can make. It's incredibly difficult to make the judgment. And we've got some very simple systems that are not trying to do the whole thing at all. They're a little help to teachers, and that's all. They're not pretending to solve the achievement of an examination. It was made more complicated by the BBC's intervention. I think we'd have learnt a lot more by now if that big sort of aberration hadn't happened. But it's a complicated problem. You're trying to work out the psychology of schools, of what they're going to pay for and how they want to operate, how good your software development performance is going to be. Just to give you one little example, I can't answer the question really other than to give you glimpses of how we see it. We once thought about selling software, let's make the market ever so much bigger. Let's sell into the home, not to schools. And we did some market research on maths, teaching maths with a product for the home. It was in the days of focus groups. You remember focus groups? We ran some focus groups on maths. We were going to have a product that we could sell into the home. And we ran some focus groups about parents' attitudes to that. And it was quite interesting. Mixed groups would say, oh, this looks jolly good, jolly good. Then you took mothers and fathers separately. The mothers would say to us, we'd kill to get that for our children. We'll scrimp on their food. So do something really sophisticated. Fathers would say, in general, if we're going to spend money on software, we're going to buy games. And it was and it showed you again how difficult it is to, now that's a simplistic way, but trying to persuade schools to spend large sums of money for software is very difficult. So it forces you down a rather simple route, if you understand that market. And if you look at what's actually happened, we've still, that part, the applications part of the market is terribly underdeveloped. We've got ever such a long way to go. RM's not going to solve that. No, we have partnerships with all sorts of people looking at niche areas, and I think that's the way, eventually, it might get handled. Yes.
When you spend £6 million, you've got this marvellous package.
Yes.
Next year, they seem to sue us.
That's a problem.
It's a bit flexible.
Well, it is. It is. And the interesting thing is, I said we sell it in the States. The good thing about maths is that in general, maths is maths. So up to a certain age level, roughly, it may need reorganising to match the curriculum, but the real content is maths. So, and we have sold it. We've had to Americanise it in some ways, and to match.
But basically, it is a question of
Well, yes, it is. It is. If we tried to do English literature, say, or history, then I think it would be an insoluble.
I'm teachers very good at trying to reinvent maths.
Oh yeah. In fact, saying that, I always remember. I mentioned before we did Maths Alive. I mentioned Success Maker, which we looked at in the very early 90s, and that was, by the time we'd seen it in the States and brought it here, it had been used in thousands of schools. And I remember taking it with the chap who was leading the project in RM when we were beginning to sell it to my old school, where I was chairman of the governor, so I was sort of on the they should respect me really. And the head of maths said he'd got it all wrong. Now this system doesn't understand maths, and this was after literally millions of children have been taught. And you're right, it's extraordinarily difficult because when it's not just teachers, it's university academics, all academics, slightly generalising. And it's why they're academics, because they do like to nag away at issues.
I can't resist.
Oh yes, you can.
I'm not resisting. Your maths is maths is maths, but from personal experience, maths is maths is maths until you get to Cambridge.
Well, Cambridge, of course, well, as I say, I live in Oxford, so I went. we won't go there. Is there one?
Just a quick one, John. You mentioned you make the lowest power consumption PC on the market.
Sorry?
You mentioned you make the lowest power consumption
Yes.
PC on the market. What is that product? What's its name?
It's that one there. With the previous chief executive of RM, not the current one, a chap called Tim Pearson, who was the current one is superb, as was his predecessor. They're very different sort of personalities. But Tim Pearson, the previous one, is really serious about the environment. And he said to the engineers, go away and produce a PC with the whole lot that consumes less than 50 milliwatts. And they went away and got way below that by using unorthodox components. So it's no good doing it unless it's a high volume product. It doesn't make a big enough impact. Because what we were trying to do is help schools get their consumption down. If everybody used that machine, all schools, you could shut a power station. It's that serious. Instead, they replaced them. So and we haven't told the world that yet, and I'm sure immediately they would do it.
I sit at home, got a 350 watt PC running on the desk in the lounge. The kids run it all evening.
Yeah.
And you could do what they're doing, which is Twitter and instant messaging on a text-based system with less than a watt.
Yes, you could. It depends what you want to do. The problem in a school is you want to run, as I say, 90 applications. Now my wife has one of those, and it uses this sort of sub 50 watt consumption, and it's one of the things we have taken really seriously, this whole green thing, and the staff are interested in it. We're back to the sort of staff. So the engineers are always trying to work out how can we knock a bit more off the consumption. Yes?
Open source.
Open source, that is a statement, or a lot of statements. We're very keen on open standards, interconnection standards. The problem is, in open source we obviously do use in some areas, where we've got Unix-based services, which we have. We live in an IBM compatible world, so there's a constraint. But when I said etc., it includes a lot of open source hidden away. But where we've got schools who are going to use things, they want PC compatible stuff because they get things from all over the place. So it's but one of the things we're trying to persuade this current government is we need common interconnection standards in schools. We need certain standards. The problem at the moment is they don't have people who talk that sort of language. No, they shouldn't understand linking things together because they've done it with two political parties. I think they have.
Any more?
Right. Let's.
Fight it out amongst yourself.
I didn't hear what you said about your operation in India.
In India, one of the problems we've got, the comment about skills, it's true that we have a skills problem in this country. Now, the governments may not like it, but when you're trying to recruit certain sorts of skill, I've just looking at the board papers yesterday, we're talking about our current recruitment of graduates. We're failing to recruit enough graduates. And we set up in India, in Kerala, because of the standard of education. Now Kerala, as you may know, has been a communist regime, then non-communist, then communist. What it's meant is they spend a vast amount on education. They've got 94% literacy in Kerala, across the men and women, 93% pounds. So the standard of education so we find it very easy to get high quality people there. It's ridiculous, really. Now, if you've gone into our office in Abingdon a few months ago, you see notices in Polish. Because we can find it easier to recruit certain sorts of skill in Poland than here. So I must stop after this. I've got to get to Birmingham, PDQ.
I was interested that you've got your own networking system.
Yes.
Back in, it must have been 87, 88, in a polytechnic, we were rolling out a Bell network
Oh, yes.
from the Salford common purchasing thing.
Yeah.
It cost practically nothing.
Yeah.
How do you compete with that?
Yeah, the question is, how do we compete with a proprietary system, really, by adding value? The problem is, to talk about CC4 would take an hour. I hinted at it. There are vast numbers of functions in there, because of the complex nature of a school, where you've got, very few organisations have every individual changing department every year. Every child changes, every child needs to access every resource from every PC. Amongst the workforce, or pupils, you've got the most destructive individual evolution's ever created, and he'll find a way in. So there are many, which is why the Guardian chap wrote what he did about CC4, and which is why it's made sense for us to invest millions of pounds adding on top of Microsoft's basic network.
Well, John, thank you very much. Talking about the CCS, it actually continues to amaze me. We have these our lectures and lecturers, and I always learn something new. I learned a lot today. I didn't know. That's a great fact.
Thank you.
Well done.
Thank you all of you very much.
Can I just quickly announce what's next? The next